So we may have just witnessed history, and not in a good way. There likely would have been a few minutes earlier today where some leaders around the world thought a Russian nuclear strike was underway, which just happens to come one day after Putin leaked that he was open to peace talks around the war in Ukraine, so long as those talks were with President-elect Trump. Now, this was, from what we can tell, a political strike designed to send a message more than, inflict any real military damage inside of Ukraine. So today we're going to talk about what we know so far, to include the type of weapon that we think was used in this strike, why Russia took this step, reactions from the two sides, and then what to expect going forward. So let's get into it. Now, a statement earlier today from the Ukrainian Air Force said, quote, an intercontinental ballistic missile was launched from the Astrakhan region of the Russian Federation. And Ukrainian President Zelensky echoed this, saying, quote, today it was a new Russian missile. All its characteristics, speed, altitude, are those of an intercontinental ballistic missile. Now, there's a little detail here that's actually really important, and we're going to go into more depth here in a minute. But whether or not it was an ICBM was actually pushed back on pretty early by some Western sources. A Western official supposedly told ABC News that Russia did not use an ICBM against Ukraine, contradicting Ukraine's Air Force. The official said it was a ballistic missile, but declined to characterize it further, saying the impact was still being assessed. So right out the gate here, I want to be clear that we don't know exactly the weapon type that was used, and that is going to be important in assessing what this actually means. But a lot of the commentary right now is pointing to this likely being an RS-26 Rubezh, R-U-B-E-Z-H, which is kind of an ICBM. And we actually have quite a bit of footage showing the actual impact of this weapon system inside of Ukraine. What you're seeing in this clip is the MIRV payload, MIRV, which stands for Multiple Independent Reentry Vehicle. And what that means is as this singular munition is fired from inside of Russian territory, these multiple reentry vehicles break apart, each with their own warhead. And these are designed, this is important, to carry nuclear warheads. So each one of those little things coming down from the sky traditionally would have its own nuclear warhead. That makes it incredibly hard for even modern air defense to effectively defeat all of those, right? It's hard enough for an air defense system to shoot a singular missile out of the sky, but if that one missile turns into 4 or 6 separate warheads kind of flying in the same general but also different points of impact, coming at different points of impact, it becomes that much harder to actually shoot them all down. So imagine something like this flying at a large military base, right? You might be able to get, say, 3 of the 4 MIRV shot down, but one of those nuclear warheads still impacting is going to cause a lot of damage. So that's kind of the weapon system that we're looking at here. Now, the difference between an ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile, and IRBM, intermediate range ballistic missile, by and large, the difference is range, right? So an ICBM is 5,500 kilometers or greater, whereas an IRBM is 1,000 to 5,500 kilometers. That's generally where the two break down, but there's also another big difference here that really applies to what we just saw play out in Ukraine. ICBMs are like exclusively nuclear armed. Just based off the size and what's needed to fire a missile at that range, it's going to end up being a nuclear warhead. There really aren't, that I'm aware of, any ICBMs with conventional weapons payloads, right? Whereas IRBMs have been launched historically, right? I think Scuds that were fired by Saddam Hussein back in the day classified as IRBMs. I believe some of what Iran launched at U.S. troops in Iraq previously were IRBMs. Intermediate range ballistic missiles have been used in war. They are regularly outfitted with conventional warheads. That's where the key difference comes in here. So the launch of this system, assuming that it was either an ICBM or an IRBM, would have triggered multiple early warning systems worldwide because, again, if it was an ICBM particularly, it would have the assumption there is that it's nuclear. We've seen Russia use countless missile systems like the Kinzhal, the Iskander, and others that technically could carry nuclear warheads, but they haven't, obviously, at all throughout this entire conflict. So when a Kinzhal is fired or an Iskander is fired, the assumption there is not that it's a nuclear strike underway. It's just not what Russia has done at this point. I think probably we've all become a little bit numb to just assuming that it's not going to be nuclear. When an ICBM is launched, the assumption there is that it's going to be nuclear. So in this case, from the assessments that I've been able to see, it looks like this would have triggered early warning systems around the world. Given the high trajectory that it would have had to be launched at to strike inside of Ukraine, it would have been clear very, very early that the intended point of impact here was Ukraine and not somewhere else across Europe. However, again, given the fact that this may have been an ICBM, if that was the case, the assumption there has to be that it was nuclear until it actually impacted. And going back to the footage here for a second, the reason you're not seeing any big detonations is, again, there's no clear way that we know of to attach conventional warheads to quickly swap those out into an ICBM, right? So if the option there is essentially either nuclear payload, or you remove that payload and end up being like inert reentry vehicle. So still obviously can do a lot of damage, but it's not like you can swap a conventional munition on there. So in turn, you're really just seeing this entire weapon system play out, less the nuclear detonation at the very end. So think about that for a second. How many people around the world, be it a few dozen, maybe at most, knew about this launch, were watching this, and had to wait on the edge of their seat until it impacted in Dnipro to know for sure if those were inert warheads or nuclear warheads? That's wild. We haven't been there in my lifetime, at least. Now, getting into the reason why Russia carried this out, they haven't put out any official statements at this point. In fact, they had kind of this weird deal where someone called into a press conference while their spokesperson was talking to like tell the spokesperson, we don't have a comment, and it was on speaker. It was weird, kind of very performative.
Да. Алло. Да, у меня брифинг.
Я боюсь Маша удар баллистическими ракетами, о чем Запад не стали говорить, не комментирую вообще.
Да, хорошо, спасибо.
But by and large, no official statements from Russia at this point. However, it is pretty safe to assume that this was Russia's response to the recent Ukrainian strikes inside of Russian territory with Western-provided munitions. Remember, it was just a couple days ago, this past Sunday, where Ukraine gained that permission. And on Tuesday, we saw the first U.S. ATACMS, or Army Tactical Missile System, hit targets in Bryansk, Russia. That strike was confirmed by the Russian Ministry of Defense. And then yesterday, we had videos coming out, including this one here, showing Storm Shadow missiles impacting a Russian command post in Kursk. Now, what we know from these Storm Shadow strikes, we haven't seen a BDA or battle damage assessment from Bryansk yet. Don't know the impact of that ATACMS strike. The Storm Shadow strike here supposedly was targeting an underground command post that was being used by Russian and North Korean troops in Kursk. And Fighter Bomber, a Russian military blogger here, said that 6 Ukrainian Su-24s fired a total of 12 Storm Shadow missiles with a flight time of roughly 2.5 minutes, adding that some of those were intercepted. Of course, we do see at least some of those impacts striking home here. Storm Shadows, again, a British cruise missile. These also could have been Scalp. That's the French version. Either way, you have Western-provided munitions this week, for really the first time, striking targets inside of Russian territory. Given the timing, we kind of have to assume that this is Russia's response to that most recent move by the United States, United Kingdom, France, the West in general, and Ukraine. So again, we don't have anything official coming from the Russian government at this point, but at times like this, historically what Russia has done is kind of push their messaging through unofficial channels. So I thought it'd be helpful to take a look at some of those and kind of get an idea of what Russia is trying to convey with this most recent round of escalatory strikes, right? Call it an ICBM or an IRBM. Either way, neither one has been used in this war. It's certainly a new step that we haven't seen yet. So starting with Fighter Bomber, a Russian military blogger, he said, quote, "They're called MRBMs, grandchildren of the pioneer, as we can arrange such beautiful fireworks in a nuclear or non-nuclear version relatively inexpensively at any point in Europe because their range is somewhere up to 6,000 kilometers. And how many of them do we have? Who knows? Well, one less. Or the Houthis will steal them from us. And you know these Houthis." Side point there. I'm going to come back to that. So Fighter Bomber is actually kind of pushing back on a lot of what we've heard so far. So again, he's saying it's an MRBM, medium-range ballistic missile, which would actually be even less than an IRBM, but also that the range exceeds that of an ICBM. So it's kind of contradictory, right? And you're mixing up the terminology here. I don't know if that's being done on purpose or not, but it certainly is confusing. But you get part of the messaging right there, saying they're able to swap out conventional and nuclear warheads easily. That's not something we've often seen, and I haven't seen any evidence that Russia is able to do that with this specific weapon system. If they can, You would think that they just used conventional warheads. But again, based on that video, it doesn't actually look like there were any detonations at points of impact. Anyways, this thing about the Houthis, that's the group down in Yemen slinging missiles and drones into the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea. And he's not the first Russian in recent days to threaten. Maybe the best response here is to give the Houthis more advanced Russian weaponry. So that's good for everyone around the world. Now, turning to Rybar, they said, quote, last night, Russian forces carried out another attack on Ukrainian territories during which an intercontinental ballistic missile could have been used. This can be seen as a clear signal to the sponsors of the so-called Ukraine against the backdrop of the West's permission to use long-range missiles. How well they understood it, time will tell. But today's strike is indeed a non-trivial move, as nothing like this has happened before. And there are reasons to believe that this will not be the last such use. And it's actually something that a lot of these folks hammered on, right? And looking across Russian media right now, they're celebrating this. This is kind of the strongman move. Hey, look, we did it. We showed them. We're serious, is by and large the message that I'm seeing. Moving back to Fighter Bomber here, he says, quote, in general, the gloomy silence of the West, the evacuation of embassies the day before, and the statements about the use of the RS-26 are beating. So we warned our counterparties and allies that we would hit the Ukrainians with a non-nuclear ICBM. It's the first and only report I've seen of that, suggesting again that this was relayed to Americans and others beforehand, so there wouldn't be some sort of nuclear escalation. Again, you have to keep in mind with any of these ICBMs, there's so many groups watching these launch sites that when one goes off, you have so little time to identify, is that a test? Is it real? What's going on here? And decide whether or not you're going to respond. So it is kind of common to announce when an ICBM launch or even a practice is going to take place. Of course, North Korea never does that, and that's always part of the tensions on the Korean Peninsula. Fighter Bomber here is the only person I've seen saying the United States and others were actually warned about this. He added, well, in order to not be bullshitting, we used it. So far, one. But we need a lot of tests, and it wouldn't hurt to test other missiles and weapons. For example, the Avangard or Poseidon. Why should such a testing ground go to waste? So kind of, referring to the war in Ukraine as a testing ground, to keep kind of pushing back against, really any gains that Ukraine makes with the most advanced weaponry Russia has in their arsenal. Now I want to dig deeper for a second into why Russia may have wanted to do this. And there's the one argument that I think tracks pretty well here. It's in direct response to Western munitions striking inside of Russian territory. That seems hard to ignore. Another piece here is kind of messaging and psychological warfare. Again, terrorizing the West in general. How many people over the course of the last 12 hours thought that a nuclear strike was imminent? But there's another little piece here that I think is important to keep an eye on. It's possible that this was done as a way to kind of test the United States, NATO, the UK, everybody's response to a single nuclear missile strike on Ukraine. Because again, it may have looked like that was happening for a short period of time, and there was no response, and we still haven't seen a response. Now, you could read into that a couple different ways. We know now that it wasn't nuclear, so good that the U.S. didn't launch some sort of retaliatory nuclear strike that spiraled us into a global war. Or the other argument is that we were just going to let it happen. And that, we don't want a nuclear war, we don't want a nuclear strike, but we might not be jumping into some sort of offensive action if that nuclear strike is going to be, contained inside of Ukraine. That is total speculation in either direction, but I don't think we should rule out the idea that an ICBM launch by Russia can be used to test how the world reacts, especially if it's very clear very early on that that warhead is going to be impacting in Ukraine. And not in Paris, not in Brussels, not in London, not in the United States. Now, it's worth mentioning that this newest escalation, which this is big, this is a big step that Russia just took, came just one day after reports leaked that Putin was open to ceasefire negotiations so long as President-elect Trump was the one that oversaw those. And I think it's worth remembering at this point that nothing happens in a vacuum, right? All of this is connected in some way, shape, or form. Now, this is one of those stories that it's kind of coming out through leaks and behind the scenes and officials familiar with the matter, so take it with a big grain of salt. It's the first we've really seen of this, though, of Putin signaling that he would be open to talking with the incoming president. When looking at the terms that have so far been leaked, it's not all that different than what we've seen in the past. They kind of hammered on the fact that Russia would not accept any territorial concessions, that Russia would keep all occupied territories, so you've got, in that case, Crimea, Kharkiv, Zaporozhye, Crimea, Kherson, Zaporozhye, Luhansk, Donetsk. And then there's some questions here that kind of went unanswered. What about the little territory in Kharkiv that the Russians occupied? That wasn't addressed. Neither was the Ukrainian force situation in Kursk. That wasn't addressed either. But they did say as a part of this, Ukraine would not be permitted to join NATO. And then the last piece here that was missing, that's been in every other plan put forward by Russia, was any sort of cap or restriction on the size and the capabilities of the Ukrainian military post-war. That was absent from this round, so keep an eye on it. We'll see if this evolves. But again, yesterday it comes out that Putin's open to ending this war so long as Trump is the one negotiating the ceasefire. Really 12 hours later, definitely less than 24 hours later, we've got an ICBM possibly flying into Ukrainian territory. Now, diving into the analysis here, there's a few different takes that I've seen so far that I thought were worth mentioning. Unfortunately, they're all pretty much along the same lines that we've seen now for quite a while. I was really hopeful, and maybe this is the optimistic side of me, that somebody that was, a Ukraine hawk would maybe put out a very detailed, rational analysis of, wait a minute, now we should stop because it's gone too far, or vice versa, right? Somebody saying we should stop arming Ukraine maybe would see this and say, we got to double down. But that's not what happened. Everybody's still in their same camps, but a couple worth diving into here. So first off, there's some saying that Putin is bluffing, and that the people that have been saying that Putin is bluffing, they're pointing to this as kind of a desperate measure on his behalf when nothing else has worked, kind of using this as evidence that he won't go nuclear, but is going to continue threatening this to try to get his way over and over again, kind of like a temper tantrum. Same assessment that we've seen from that camp for a lot of this war, right? And for what it's worth, it's been accurate. Technically, it's still been accurate because they're still threatening nuclear weapons and they still haven't used nuclear weapons. That is one camp, similar assessment we've seen in the past. Others are pointing at this as a kind of clear escalation, obviously coming right after Western-provided munitions began impacting Russia, and they point to this as evidence that we finally found that red line and that Putin is showing that he means business, and that he would rather use nuclear weapons before backing down. And this is kind of where the whole argument for support of Ukraine sits right now. It's been forced into this nuclear conversation. So really when the war first started, there was a lot of concern, a lot of talk about the possibility of nuclear escalation. That went away. And then all of a sudden it wasn't really in the conversation for like a couple of years. I mean, not occasionally, like every other month or something, Russia would throw out some veiled nuclear threat about anything and everything. For anybody who's not been paying attention to the war, Russia has threatened nuclear strikes if Ukraine took back their own territory inside of Ukraine. So it's a common occurrence, and at some point you just kind of get used to hearing it. But either way, it wasn't really a focus of the conversation. It is again, right? So right now we're back to the point where nuclear war is the focus of the conversation around supporting Ukraine. And look, that raises the stakes. That makes more people chime in that otherwise might not have a strong opinion in one way or the other. And just from what I'm seeing, just looking out across the information space from popular US-based accounts, my gut tells me that this shift in the conversation is working in Putin's favor. So maybe it's just the noise. That's always really hard to parse out on social media. But these recent threats and actions, I should mention, I'm seeing a lot more commentary around we need to end this now to avoid a nuclear war, compared with it's time to double down and help Ukraine, push forward to victory or force Russia out of Ukraine. And, if we're talking about ending the war right now based off of the plan that Putin just put forward yesterday, that's essentially on Putin and Russia's terms to the detriment of Ukraine. Again, I would expect this tension to continue to kind of ratchet up rather than dial back down at all in the coming weeks before the new Trump administration comes into office. But we'll have to see where this takes us. But that's all I got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.